Hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Hi Squale, Hi Tapka, CM, Hualanitum, Gay Men's Health Summit, Aintha, Tis, E, Simultan. My English name is Rocky. I would like to thank the coordinators of the Gay Men's Health Summit. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank you for allowing me to be here. I would also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the chiefs of the local tribes and the elders of the local communities. Haitsepka. I would also like to invite the good spirits of the four directions into this room. As mentioned, I will be discussing the institutional impacts of Indigenous men's health. I will be specifically focusing on the colonial institutional impacts. I've developed a preliminary study that explores the colonial institutional impacts that Indian residential schools have had on Indigenous men's health. If there is anybody who feels any discomfort after this presentation, please contact me after I'm finished. I can connect you with health support in Vancouver if you are Indigenous or non-Indigenous. My study primarily focuses on the absence of material and academic databases on the topic of Indigenous GLBT human rights in Canada. An absence of Indigenous GLBT perspectives on the topic of Indigenous GLBT human rights in academic databases indicates that Indigenous GLBT people have not held enough decision-making roles to contribute to the topic. If Indigenous people are not contributing as leaders and writers, then Indigenous people are being written about, which is an action in danger of being synonymous with colonial anthropological efforts that excluded interpretations of the people being studied. I searched mainstream sources of media and found the occasional piece in regards to including Indigenous people in pride parades and pride events, but still failed to find a piece of work written by an Indigenous GLBT leader that critiqued social customs, organizational behavior, and public and private policy from an Indigenous perspective. This brings me back to work explored earlier in my master's thesis on the topic of fear-based learning in Indian residential schools. First Nations people in Indian residential schools learn through abuse to hate themselves and to desire to be something other than what they were. The first Indian residential school opened in the 1870s and the last school closed in 1996. 130 Indian residential schools were located across Canada. More than 150,000 Aboriginal children attended Indian residential schools. There are about 80,000 Indian residential school survivors alive today. Indian residential schools are not part of a far-off history. People are still dealing with the institutional impacts today. There are thousands of survivors struggling to cope with self-hatred, substance abuse, and chronic health conditions. The nature of oppression occurred through targeting the sexuality of children who lacked the intellectual and emotional capacity to understand what was happening to them, their brothers and sisters, and their identity as Indigenous people. The impact on Indigenous sexuality is demonstrated in assessment tools in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. The survivors can simultaneously suffer from difficulties with interpersonal relationships, obsessive compulsive and panic states, some post-traumatic stress disorder, occasional sexual dysfunction, addiction to drugs, retaliatory rage, and self-inflicted injury. Fear-based learning is a unique process that developed in Indian residential schools. It occurred in the relationship between Indian residential school administrators, such as priests, nuns, support staff, and children. Children who did not die in school because of sexual abuse, malnutrition, or murder were not provided with emotional tools to resolve multiple traumatic experiences. Fear-based learning spread from the residential school into the family home, into the community, into administrations, and into the First Nations psyche. As one person puts it, self-hate is necessary for fear-based learning to continue to exist. There is an impact of fear-based learning on Indigenous GLBT leadership in Canada. With 150,000 children having attended Indian residential schools and a majority involving generations of families, fear-based learning definitely inhibited leadership opportunities for Indigenous GLBT people. When Indigenous GLBT human rights leadership issues are absent in academic materials, where does one begin to right the wrong? We center knowledges produced by Indigenous GLBT two-spirited people in order to counter colonial representation, affirm Indigenous GLBT two-spirited intellectual histories, and foreground multiplicity among Indigenous people to critically examine their production within power relations. Up until recently, I have failed to affirm Indigenous GLBT intellectual histories in BC because I thought other Indigenous people were doing so for me, particularly Coast Salish men. If anyone has participated in affirming Indigenous GLBT human rights and intellectual histories, please share them with me. To create and enhance educational materials on Indigenous GLBT human rights, we center knowledges produced by Indigenous GLBT two-spirited people in order to counter colonial representation. Given Indigenous GLBT men a moment in time to reconcile their truth with the GLBT community provides healing desperately needed by such men, creates opportunities to re-establish a connection with culture. And Indigenous people, GLBT men, need to reconcile their coming out experience with two different communities: tribal communities and GLBT communities. I personally offer to the summit the idea of subjectless critique and its use in policy development. The subjectless critique is a tool that can be used to work with Indigenous GLBT people across race, gender, and class. What is required for bringing Indigenous GLBT leadership out of the closet is a relational position that does not isolate men from the rest of society. What might be called the subjectless critique of queer studies disallows any positing of a proper subject of or object for the field by insisting that queer has no fixed political referent. A subjectless critique establishes a focus on a wide field of normalization as the site of social violence. Due to the multidimensional nature of Indigenous GLBT identity in British Columbia, by not having a proper subject for men to fit into, freedom is created to share individual interpretations of Indigenous GLBT human rights, and to invite others into, for example, discussions of how gay men from isolated reserves end up in urban areas and how they interpret their existing health concerns and treaty rights back home. An Indigenous GLBT man from Vancouver Island may be Canadian, First Nations, Coast Salish, gay, bisexual, or transgender, and possibly transitioning into male or female while transitioning into same-sex sexuality. I further offer the idea of relational regionalism. The framework is not actually coherent without more specific tribal studies that serve to buttress and challenge it. In working with tribal communities, I have discovered that it takes years to develop a relationship with the tribe, let alone developing a relationship with the broader tribal nations. Staff are usually bogged down with trying to meet their own personal mandates, that it becomes arduous to maintain a working relationship. Adding to this difficulty is the tension that exists between tribal communities. Like other organizations, tribal ones compete with each other for a scarce amount of resources. This political environment and the background of an Indigenous GLBT person's life is important to understand because it contains unknown information that is vital to understanding the layered political environment affecting the mental well-being of Indigenous GLBT people living on and off reserve. There are 3 First Nations on Vancouver Island alone: the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, Nuu-chah-nulth Nation, and the Coast Salish Nation. Each nation is home to several different tribes. Each tribe may have different dialects compared to its nearest neighbors. The power relations between tribes and between nations can serve as a powerful analytical tool in policy development for Indigenous GLBT people. But such material remains in the closet. I share with the summit the idea of sexual survivance. Survivance was a gift shared with me by my academic mentors to replace the word survivor. They explained to me that when you are a survivor, you have lived in the effect of someone else's actions. When you live from survivance, you're able to live from a place of self-empowerment, and you are not living in the effect of someone else's actions. You're able to determine courses of action yourself. The nature of survivance creates a sense of narrative resistance to absence, literary tragedy, nihility, and victimry. I am here in my own act of survivance, and the realization that the topic of Indigenous GLBT human rights are absent from academic databases. I resist the notion that Indigenous GLBT people have been absent to provide their worldview interpretations. I resist the understanding that Indigenous GLBT men are helpless health risks that require intervention from sources of power outside of themselves. Through acts of sexual survivance, Two-Spirit men extend Indian-specific meanings about conquest, race, colonialism, and sovereignty to desire, whereby the Two-Spirit sexual encounter is governed by sexual historicity rendered modern. The sexual identity of Indigenous GLBT men in Canada and connection to colonization, resistance, and sovereignty has yet to be explored by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members of the GLBT community. In closing, material needs to be generated that invites more Indigenous GLBT men into academia and activism. Work needs to focus on the ability to create theory from Indigenous self-representation that reflects Indigenous people's complexity. Whew, did it. Thank you. Thank you very much.